Okay. Good evening, virtual visitors. My name is Naya Hardaway, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for the African American History Initiative here at the Missouri Historical Society. Welcome to our program, and thank you for joining us tonight. Before I get started, I would like to give a special thanks to McDonald's for sponsoring our Black History Month events. Thank you also to our members, donors, and supporters from the Zoo Museum Tax District. Okay. Okay, welcome to our Find Your Roots program. Today we'll be hearing from Jim Vincent. Jim Vincent is the president and co-founder of the St. Louis African American Genealogy and History Society, and he is a St. Louis native. Tonight, he'll be sharing with us a demonstration of how to trace our ancestors through resources available to us over the internet and here in St. Louis. We are proud to partner with the St. Louis African American Genealogy and History Society to create a program that honors the lived experiences and memory of our ancestors. Tonight's program will run for about 90 minutes, which includes the presentation from our guest speaker and a 15-minute Q&A. For your convenience, you can submit questions through the Q&A button in your toolbar. And in order to streamline the process, we would prefer that you wait until the end to ask your questions. Please know that we will do our best to answer all questions, but we may not have time to get to everyone. At this time, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Jim Vincent.
Thank you, Nia. And I want to thank the Missouri History Museum for inviting me to participate. I hope I can help some of you out there with some pressing questions that you have. Let me also extend my appreciation and thanks for those of you who have given up your time this evening for this webinar. I want to specifically thank Nia for her able help and patience with getting this whole program together and helping me and answering some of my questions. What I'd like to do this evening, I've been asked not to give you the usual same old how to get started, because I think by this time, so many people have already heard the basics. So we're going to go through the basics very, very quickly. What I wanted to do is to give you some information for you to think about, thinking outside the box that will help you move through your research in a more efficient and sometimes even creative ways. So with the first slide here, finding and tracing your African family in unusual documents. African Americans often, because of slavery, did not appear in the usual documents. For example, birth records when they became available, or even death records. Frequently, African Americans who had been enslaved were not even buried in marked graves. We want to see if we can find some ways to help you narrow those things down. And again, as I said, to make your search a little more efficient, and you will find that you will be doing the happy dance more frequently as you discover new and exciting things about your ancestors. Give me the next slide. So the next slide, please. Let's begin with, as they say at the beginning, the African slave trade, or the Atlantic slave trade, began in 1619, when the first dozen or so Africans were brought to the Americas. The United States Constitution prohibited further importation of enslaved Africans in the United States by 1808. However, the trade continued until the end of the Civil War in 1865. Many of you may already know that there were slave ships illegally transporting enslaved Africans even even after the Civil War. The United States Constitution, however, although it prohibited slavery, it did not make it illegal for slavery within the United States. And that leads us to some interesting information that you want to explore when you're doing your African American family history. Next slide. See, I don't know if, I guess I need to move my, yeah. Okay. The migration or importation of slaves, this is the Constitution. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. Now, I want to call your attention to something here. Now, this you can go right to the Constitution and read it. Article 1, Section 9. Notice how the Congress assiduously avoided using the word slave. The word slave will not appear in the Constitution. It is that they knew what they were doing was not right, but they were looking down the line in history and saying, we don't want to be accused of this. We will pretend that we don't recognize that it happened when in fact it was recognized. Next slide, please. As we go through this a little process this evening, we want to ask ourselves some questions and see if we can answer some of them. What records about enslaved persons were created and why? If we ask why, then that may give us a clue as to where we might go to look for things. What did enslaved persons say about themselves and their conditions? And where can we locate such records? Well, the beautiful thing about the internet is every minute, almost every second, thousands and thousands of documents are coming online, or at least there is some way to determine where you might find them. And I know that many of you are not nerds like me in this stuff. You don't want to try to memorize where everything is. So we need to have some techniques to find records as we think about them and as we ask these questions. And then finally, for our concern this evening, what practical interest was slavery to the federal, state, and local governments? That is to say, what interest other than a moral interest did either of these government levels have in slavery? And, of course, how can we find this information? Next slide. Just to give us a brief overview of how we begin, African American Families Research begins like any other group. From the present time to the 1870s, African Americans families can be researched pretty much like any other ethnic groups. As they say, we start with ourselves and work backwards. We interview grandparents, if they're still around, or great-grandparents, if they're still around. I interviewed my grandparents before they left us. Don't forget to interview aunts and uncles, because aunts and uncles, even if you interview your parents, aunts and uncles may know things that your parents may not know if they're older, or if they had a different or separate relationship with grandparents and parents. You know, the old thing about the favorite child. Also, don't overlook cousins. Sometimes cousins have information that even aunts and uncles don't have. It just depends upon who is interested and who is curious about something and happens to ask a specific question at a specific time and get an answer that nobody else in the family has. So you have to stay on top of that. Also, you want to ask questions of family friends. You know those old friends who show up at all of the family rituals, social functions, Christmas Eve, birthday parties, weddings, funerals, and we sometimes refer to them as cousin so-and-so or uncle so-and-so, and they're not really related. These are people we call fictive kin, that is, people that we regard as kinfolks, even though they're not related by blood. Don't overlook those people, especially if they're older than you, because they may have had conversations with your ancestors or with your grandmother or grandfather or whomever. And because they were adults, they didn't share that with you as a child. So you need to ask them some questions. I've discovered a lot of information that way, especially after I got grown. Don't overlook the family minister. He or she may have some information that may be helpful to you. My own grandmother, for example, was one of the founding members of one of the major Baptist churches here in St. Louis. And so there is a record of her involvement and input. Uh, of course, if I had known the minister back in that day, I could have asked him information about her. He may have had personal information about her. The other thing that is frequently overlooked is asking questions of the family doctor. Now, if a family doctor may not be, and in this day with the HIPAA law, a family doctor may not be able to disclose certain information, but he or she may have some information that may be of help to you. Now, remember, whenever you go to the doctor, the first thing the doctor does is he or she wants to take a medical history of you. Did your father have such and such a thing? Did your mother have? What is prevalent in your family in terms of diseases? So you may want to ask those kinds of questions that your doctor may be able to share with you. The other thing is funeral directors. So this is something else that people frequently overlook. The funeral director keeps extensive records, and they have to fill out extensive forms for the state when they create a funeral for your ancestor. Those records are often kept by the state, and they have lots and lots of information, such as relationships of people, where the person lived, maybe even what kind of work they did. Now, knowing what kind of work your ancestor did could give you some clues. Let me give you a personal example. My great-grandfather worked in a lead mine until he retired. When he retired, of course, he had ingested lead poisoning, and it eventually took him away from here. If people don't know that lead poisoning can be passed on from generation to generation, there may be some medical conditions that crop up in your life that you don't know about, or if you know about it, you may be able to do something about it early on. That is important, but it also, knowing that information, again, you get specific information about the person, the funeral director, where the person lived, a social security number, how much education they might have had, just things like that. So don't overlook the funeral director's records. Many funeral directors, funeral homes go out of business, but you might want to check with a library, a historical society, a manuscript collection, and there are many of those in and around St. Louis, or wherever you may be looking. Don't forget to ask about funeral directors' records. Next slide, please. Now, you gather all of that information from the families and friends and pile it on your living room table. No, some people just gather and it just stays there. But as we said, start at once you have the document, start with yourself and search backwards. And we're looking for your own birth records, as well as your parents or grandparents, that is birth records, marriage and death records. Much of this is online these days, and it's free. Not everything is on Ancestry.com, although I would suggest you using Ancestry.com. But what I use mostly is a free site that you probably are aware of, which is called Family Search. It is a humongous site that has so much material on it. I've been looking at it and using it, I guess, for about, I don't know, maybe 10 years now. And I still haven't mastered it all. It's got so much information and they keep putting more and more out there. So make sure that you use those. Now, all you need to do is to have, first of all, you go to familysearch.com and you sign up. It's free. Don't worry about getting a virus or anything. As I said, I've been using it 10 years and haven't gotten a virus yet because of it. But Ancestry.com, what you need is a library card. And if you go and get a library card, whether you live wherever you may live, and then you can access Ancestry.com, you usually have to go to the library. But you can make it a lot more efficient if you use Family Search and then key to Ancestry, because Family Search will say, oh, we can tell you about this document, but you have to go to Ancestry.com. Now, if you're doing your research at home, you may make notes of that. And then when you go to the library with your library card and access Ancestry, you know exactly what to look for and how to find it. So you don't have to spend hours and hours looking for a specific document. The other thing that you will have right in front of you as you do your research or letters, which is something that we are falling away from now. People sending letters, the only thing you get now are letters from somebody who either wants some money from you or who wants you to buy something from them, I guess, which is the same thing. And I might say the same thing about postcards. We do a session here in St. Louis on ways to identify and date postcards. There is a trick to it that will help you date a postcard and will go a long way to help you identify the person, a lot about the person who sent the postcard. The same thing with what is called note cards. Look also for diaries and books. One thing about books, years ago, I thought that because African Americans were enslaved, they didn't write books. So it wasn't likely that you would be looking for an African American, especially one who was enslaved, who would be in a book, until I found my great fourth great grandma, fourth great aunt, who was in a book that was written about a man by the name of Sam Hildebrand, who was a bushwhacker in Southeast Missouri during the Civil War. And they committed an entire chapter to her. Who would have thunk it? The other thing is you want to look at pictures. And I know that most of us have in the closet, in the garage, in the attic, in the basement, under the bed, shoe boxes filled with photographs, pictures of who knows, where we look at these pictures sometimes and you wonder, well, who was this and why do I have this picture? Today, with modern technology, the same thing applies to film, audio tapes, and CDs. I don't know how many times I've talked with people and tried to work with them and help them, and they have stuff on tape and CDs, and they have no idea who the person was, or they have never taken notes about what that person was talking about. Keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a photograph of somebody that was in the 18th, now photography began about 1840. If you have a photograph of somebody, of a photograph, whatever technique it may have been, a daguerreotype or tintype or whatever the process was, the people are sitting there looking. They're looking at you. They're looking into the future. They're saying to you, I'm taking this picture because I want you to remember me. There's no other reason for them to take the picture. To this very day, you don't, even with selfies, you don't take a picture just to look at yourself. You take a picture because you want somebody else to see you. So it behooves us, our responsibility as their posterity, to do something and make sure that that picture is worthwhile, that it leads us to that person who endured, especially if they were an African-American enslaved person. They endured to make sure that you and I got here. So we at least owe them that. Next slide, please. In step 3 of our process here, we want to search magazines, newspaper from the time of the ancestors that we are looking, that we're studying. And of course, the first thing we want to do is to make sure that we observe their passing. So we look for obituaries. And again, just because a person is poor or may have been enslaved does not mean that they didn't have an obituary. I have a little snippet, if you look up at the top where it says Bertram, and it gives a little bit of information about Bertram, Teddy Bertram's passing, but it also tells about his family. This gives you clues as to your ancestors and where you might want to go and find them. It even talks about the funeral home and where he was buried. The next thing you want to look for are death notices. Now, it's starting to happen more frequently now, but certainly in Missouri, you can go to the, and I'll show you this a bit later, but you can go to the Secretary of State's office website and pull up death records. I've got a whole stack of death certificates of ancestors, and it gives you some really good information. The name of the person, their address, what they died of, their parents' name in most cases, where they're buried, and the doctor who who pronounced them dead. Also, where they were born and their birth dates. That's a lot of good information, as I've said several times already. The next thing is marriage announcements. Sometimes show up in newspapers, but if you get a marriage announcement, then you can find the marriage records, the marriage certificate, and more importantly, the marriage application. The marriage certificate will only tell you the date of the marriage and who was married, but the marriage application will give you more detailed information. If the persons were underage, parents may have had to sign for them, their age and birth dates, their address, and so forth. And this is true throughout all of the, well, I should say most of the states today. Much of this stuff is online, and you need to get familiar with familysearch.org. But you want to go further than just, my ancestor's name was Joe Smith, and he married Mary Sue Jones, and they had 6 children. That's no information, I'm sorry, that's not doing your ancestor much justice. You want to know who they were as people. So you want to look at their lifestyle. And sometimes you can find that by looking at the place where they lived and what was their social life, what was the general social life about, what was the religious life about. As you look at some of the pictures around here that I'm showing here, you know, here's a group of working people. There's on the right, a group of people dressed to the nines. I don't know, that they were going to church or someplace else. Then there's just a family, I guess, trying to make it. And of course, there's people out enjoying themselves. So look beyond just the obvious and just what you see on the paper. You know, again, you need to think creatively. The last thing here is local gossip. So I want to talk a few seconds about newspapers, African-American and generally white newspapers. Now, in generally white newspapers, you usually don't find much about African-Americans unless they are being shown in a negative light. That Joe Jones, Negro, was caught stealing a chicken or something like that. But in African-American newspapers, you get a flavor of the community and what African-Americans were doing socially, civically, politically, religiously, the things that you would expect of any community. And we're not getting into a lot of details, but I want to tell you about a couple of newspapers. Here in St. Louis, our newspaper of record, our African-American newspaper of record, is called the St. Louis Argus. Now, there are several other Black newspapers that existed and still exist, but the key one is the St. Louis Argus. And what the St. Louis Argus used to do, it was published in 1915. What it used to do, it had a section, well, 2 sections I want to call attention. One section was called the religious section, which told about happenings in the churches around town and the organizations that were associated with churches, like the Masons and so forth. But also it had a section called the out-of-town news. Now, the out-of-town news covered as much of the region as possible, as far away as maybe 200 miles away, all around the St. Louis area. And St. Louis is on the river right across from Illinois, so it also included Illinois regions as well. And from those articles, I was able to find an article about my mother on her third birthday party. And the person who was doing the little writing really gave some information that made me see not just my mother, but my grandparents in a different light in the little town that they lived in called Fredericktown. And this person who did the writing was sort of the local gossip keeper. So she would write about the African-American families in the area and send it on to the St. Louis Argus, who would then print it. And luckily, in these days and times, we can look back and I could read about my mother's third birthday party. So look at those newspapers. Now, a couple of newspapers I want to mention. The Pittsburgh Courier was a national newspaper, and I believe it was published once a week, maybe twice a month, maybe once a week. There was the Chicago Defender, which was or still is a major newspaper that gives information about the African American community. These two newspapers were key during the civil rights era. The Pullman Porters, and I wish we had enough time to go into the Pullman Porters, the Pullman Porters, who were sort of stewards on the trains back in the days, who waited on people, carried their bags and shined their shoes and all that sort of thing. They would carry surreptitiously, they would carry copies of the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender into the South, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, where there were articles written by Black journalists about the movement of the civil rights movement, which is why so many African Americans were able to get the news of what was going on throughout the country with regard to segregation and so forth. And they would secretly sell those papers and get a little extra pay from the paper, from the sales of the paper. They were like being adult newspaper salesmen. Next slide, please. Now, when we talked about earlier, the Constitution saying that slavery was, the importation of African slaves were prohibited after 1808. And remember I said after, not during or before, but after 1808. It did not prohibit slavery domestically. People still could sell and transport enslaved people within the United States and its territories after 1808. So during the early 1800s, a brisk internal slave trade was sustained within the US boundaries. Enslaved persons continued to be sold from state to state, both in the North and the South. Next slide, please. Now, because this was even before the railroads, the transportation mode was by ships or steamboats. So here's what had to happen. You see this slide, each, and I'm going to use this word cargo, because the enslaved people they carried on board were considered cargo, not passengers. They were cargo. So as the cargo was put upon the ship, the captain had to generate something called a manifest. And as you can see where the arrow is pointing, where it says manifest, it says manifest of Negroes. And so it gives the name of the ship and the name of the captain and the port of debarkation. Below that, you see the entire list. I believe that's 27 26 enslaved people. But here is something that those of us who are doing genealogy can benefit from. We have those names of those enslaved people, the names. Now, I want to make that clear. We have the names of these enslaved people, where you hear a lot of times where they say, well, we can't find the names of these slaves because in the slave schedule, they only have a number. These enslaved people were being transferred from one place to the other, and they had to be listed with their age and their color, their gender. At the bottom here, where the arrow is pointing, you see that the captain and the commissioner had to sign and co-sign to say that this list is correct. So you have here an assurance of the correctness of this manifest. Now, the law required that if you had 26 enslaved people on board when you leave port, you had to have those same people when you reach your port of destination. So now we can track where these enslaved people were brought from and where they were taken to. That's new information. We also have the names. So how do you use this? Remember what we said earlier. From 1870 back, there were no names. Enslaved people were not listed with names in most documents. You had to look at wills and probates, and we're not going to go through that right now. But here we can trace, if they went to Plantation Candyland, we can look at who owned Plantation Candyland and find out the owner and look at the owner's probate, his will, or whatever we're searching, and see if those names crop up. Because if that owner sold any of those slaves to a third party, that would be a bill of sale. So now we're tracking that enslaved person forward. That's a benefit. Next slide, please. This is just another manifest of showing those enslaved people arriving. And as you can see here, they went from New York to the port of Savannah, Georgia. Let's look at that top. And then there's frequently some language that showed that these people were not being sold or transported before 1808. This information is available, again, at familysearch.org. You don't have to dig into barrels and things like many of us did back in the old days. You can sit there at your dining room table with your bunny slippers on and a cup of tea, and you can go through all of this stuff. Next slide, please. Okay, that arrow is just pointing to the name of the person who was the cargo and where she went, signed by the collector. Now, you can find this information in microfilm form at the St. Louis County Library. So if you're not in St. Louis, I would try to see if my local public library has such a thing. However, if you have a library card or you know someone who has one, then you might be able to access the St. Louis City, which is slpl.org, or the St. Louis County, which is slcl.org, be able to access from wherever you are. I would expect that if you were from Chicago or some city like that, your library would have such a thing. And again, as I've said, it's familysearch.org. And if you're paying for ancestry.com, you can find it through there. And in Missouri, you can use the Missouri History Society's website. Next slide, please. So, what happened? Well, okay, leave it there. We're going to switch topics here for a bit to talk about another part of African American life and journey in this country, and that is the Great Depression. Now, don't think that this is separated. This brings us into the modern era. The Great Depression struck this nation in 1929, and unemployment grew to over 60%. So you can imagine you reach out and touch someone, and you're touching someone who's unemployed. And the great majority of those who were unemployed, of course, were people of African descent. By 1939, the federal government had instituted a number of work projects that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was generating, at least under his leadership, was generating a lot of programs to try to stall the growing unemployment and business failures. African American men and women participated in these efforts in large numbers. One of which, and I found this to be very helpful, and so many people don't know about it, which is why I decided to include it, is the Civilian Conservation Corps, generally known as the CCC. What it was sort of a paramilitary, or maybe I don't want to call it, it was a military-like organization run by the government, where young men could volunteer for 6 months or a year or whatever, and they would go into this Civilian Conservation Corps, and they would use their skills or learn new skills as to building parks, national parks, planting trees, building roads, working as clerks in government offices, learning, as I said, skills like civil engineering, cleaning up waterways. So they were doing all of these things that still exist today, and we sort of take for granted. If you go to a national park today, or even a state park, chances are that some African Americans were involved in that. Now, there were thousands of both Black and white young men. Now, so what these young men could do is that they could volunteer and go into this, and I believe they made something like $40 a month. Half of that, or most of that, would be sent home to their relatives to help take care of the families. That is not just their married families, but their parents and so forth. And they had to apply to get into these things. That's another document that would be beneficial for you if you're researching your African American family, because many of these young men joined, did their 6 months, then they had to get out, then they had to rejoin again. So you may find 4 or 5 applications at the National Archives, the National Archives for this. Again, the National Archives can be accessed through Family Search. So don't overlook that. The last thing here on in this section is that the government hired artists and musicians who worked as writers. The Federal Writers Project. These were writers like Zordell Hurston, or artists, or poets like Langston Hughes, people like that wrote for them, but there was a whole panoply of people who had writing skills who could go into the South, the Southern states, the former slave states, and interview former slaves. Because in 1929 and 1939, there were still living a large number of former enslaved people in the South, and they wanted to capture their stories. So with this is how we begin to learn and understand what African Americans, enslaved African Americans, thought about slavery and thought about their condition and themselves and how they wanted to move forward. And in some cases, they did not want to move forward, believe it or not. But if slavery is all you know, what would you expect? Next slide, please. Okay, I've just said all that. So the Writers Project led to this. What we know today, the results are known as the slave narratives. Now, as these writers interviewed these people, they sent their documents back, and these documents were put into volumes so that each Southern state has volumes of enslaved people or formerly enslaved people who were interviewed by these writers during the Writers Project. And this is online. Again, you can be on your computer and you can pull this, just go to a state that you're interested in, whether it's Alabama or Missouri or Mississippi or wherever it might be, wherever enslaved people were held, there are several volumes with an index. And you can find these volumes at NARA, NARA.org. And again, you can go through Family Search, but you can go directly to it through NARA.org, which is the government archives, the federal government archives. And you can get these volumes. I've used it myself. I'm going to show you what I discovered when I use it. Go to the next slide, please. I must have skipped the slide because this is the application of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And you see this application, click on it, please. If she clicks on it, you can see there's the person's name, first, second, and last name, their birth date, I'm sorry, the date that they applied, the town or city where they applied. This puts them in a specific place. Now there's his birthday. This guy happens to be 19 years old, and that's Caney, Oklahoma, where he lived. And his allotment went to his father, as you can see there. Let's see, one more, click one. Yeah, and so we get his father's name, looks like William Knight. And then there's his address. So now we know how to contact and find out where his father lived and where he lived. What can you do with that? Every large library that I know of has city directories, and you can go online through Family Search and Ancestry, and you can find city directories for most of the cities in the country. And you can look up this address. And once you look up this address, you can then go to Google Earth, which we can't go into right now, but Google Earth can take you right down so that you can see the house if it still exists, and you would know what that neighborhood is like. Next slide, please. Now, here's what I wanted to go to, going back to slave narratives. This is a copy of the first page of one of the slave narratives, A Folk History of Slavery in the United States from Interviews with Former Slaves. Next slide, please. What I found, my third great aunt lived in Fredericktown, Missouri. And this is a copy of the transcript of the interview from the slave narratives that I found. And she's saying, I've lived in Fredericktown ever since the war, and only 2 or 3 times I've been out of hollering distance of the town. I was 17 years old when the war was over. My boss was Thomas McGee in Wayne County. My mother and father were slaves. My grandmother was a Indian squaw. My mother was dead 4 years for the war, and my father was dead 3 years. Now, overlooking what I consider the necessarily fainted ignorance that the writer was trying to portray. If all you have is DE for D, trying to make it sound black, you missed the point. But she gives her age, and you can, from the time the interview was dated, you can get when she was born. More importantly, as you can see, more obviously, she says, my boss was Thomas McGee. This gives you the slave owner's name and the county they lived in. When you're doing African-American research, you will get to 1870. That was the first time that the census actually named African-Americans in the census records. When you get before that, you don't have the names. You have to look at what is called the slave narratives. We cannot get into all of that with the time that we have. But if you do a little bit of searching, you will find it. And in the slave narratives, you don't have the names of the enslaved people. You only have a check mark or tick mark by whether they were male or female and approximate age. So, but then the next thing that you have to do is that you have to start to research the owner, the white family. So you need to know who the white family was. Here, my aunt is giving that person's name and how he could be found in what county. So we can now look in the census and other places and find him and start to find out more information about him, you know, his will, his probate, things like that. Letters and such thing. And believe me, there is a ton of information out there that relates to your family in the slave owner's family. I will say this, with one of our members, we researched using just this technique. We researched her ancestors back to Liberia. Her ancestor became the vice president of Liberia and helped to found that nation. So anything is possible. So when you get down here to where she says that her mother was an Indian squaw, who am I to say that she's lying? I don't know. This is information that has to be researched out, because you cannot look at a person and determine whether or not they were Native American. you just cannot do it. It takes some research, and in today, probably DNA. So I'm saying since it was her mother, then apparently she knew what her mother was or what her mother had told her. Next slide, please. Yeah, we just talked about the migration and the African Americans who moved from the South. You could see the span of that migration from 1910 to 1970. It's a long time that people were moving out of the South. Next slide, please. As this map shows, if you can see the light blue, you can see that there's a very broad trek of an arrow pointing to St. Louis, is one of the stops, Davenport, Iowa, which I didn't even know, and Minneapolis, where it ended. In the purple, as you can see, African Americans were moving out of Mississippi and Alabama up through Springfield, Illinois, Indianapolis, Detroit, Chicago, especially Chicago. My father moved out of Arkansas up through St. Louis and then up to Detroit, where the car founders were. He eventually came back to St. Louis, of course, where he met my mother. And then on the coast, they were leaving out of Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Virginia, up to and through New York during these periods of time. And I find that my sister-in-law, my sister-in-law's family came out of South Carolina up through New York, where she was born during the same period. So at the end of that, from the 1910s through the 1960s and 70s, African Americans were moving out of the South, basically Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi, and even St. Louis, Missouri, to the west, to California. This was during World War II, where there were many war plants opening up, especially airplane factories for World War II. Next slide, please. Now, a number of reasons that African Americans started leaving the South by about 1916. This is when World War I began. One problem was the weather, drought, where everything was drying up and dust storms were blowing away the topsoil. Storms and flooding, which was just the opposite, where everything was being flooded and washed away and destroyed. One of our members of our organization this very moment is trying to locate her father's ancestors, her father's parents, who was missing during one of the greatest storms in the area that flooded Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama in 1929 floods. I just sort of added insult to injury. The other thing was the infestation of the boll weevil. This little bug destroyed the cotton crops so that there was little or no cotton to pick, so there was no way for African Americans who were sharecropping or farming or whatever, however they were making their living as farmers, they could not have income, so they had to leave. And then there's the usurpation of Black farmland. We won't get into that tonight, but trust me, there was a sustained effort to try to take the land from Black farmers. Next slide, please. The other reason of catastrophic rages of the southern states, of course, was Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan violence, the general voting rights being denied, the right to marry, as you might know, the right to marry whomever you chose is still not a law throughout the country. And of course, African Americans could not marry outside of their race until 1968 with the Lovings case, Virginia versus Loving, which I think a documentary or movie was done about it a year or so ago. There were limited educational opportunities, and that didn't resolve itself to some degree until Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. Then racism, discrimination, and segregation didn't resolve itself in the southern states until the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And more importantly, as we've already pointed out, it was limited employment opportunities, which is why so many people were moving away, especially during the war years, World War I and World War II, because the defense employment afforded a number of jobs because the government needed everybody by that time. Next slide, please. As I've already pointed out, there were two waves of migration, and both created records that are useful for family history researchers. And you can look here on the left, every man of a certain age in the United States and territory had to register for the draft. And this information is useful to us as we're researching. This too is on Family Search, the National Archives website, and Ancestry.com. One interesting thing about this particular registration card, in World War I, if you were African American and you were obligated to fill out one of these cards, you had to go to your draft board and fill out one of these cards. They clipped the left bottom edge off of the card, as you can see down there where it says 3139. That indicated that you were African American. And the reason they did that because they wanted to make sure that they assigned you to a non-combat position until the war got further in. They wanted to send you to supply and such stuff as that. As far as I'm concerned, that was a good thing, but that was the way they thought. And as you can see, as the address, city and state, the next of kin, the description of the person and the type of employment that they did. As I've just mentioned, they wanted to know what you were capable of doing. They assumed that most African Americans were incapable of doing anything with high technology or mastering complicated tasks. Next slide, please. In the second Black migration began in the 1940s at the start of World War II. So we have sort of the same thing. Young men were required, that is, all young men were required to fill out these draft registration cards. These are two cards of two of my uncles during World War II. They were twins. And as you can see, it gives their address, which I remember well, and the place where they worked. It is interesting every time I see this because I have pictures of them when they were being sworn in. So those draft registration cards can be downloaded and you can use that information, back it up or corroborate it with the city directory and the census and even their death records to help to make sure that the research you're doing is complete. Next slide. Next slide. We've gone through this already. And as I've just said, you want to corroborate the information that you have. So the dates of birth, siblings' names and ages, children's names and ages, occupations and employers' names, common surnames in nearby communities or neighborhoods. Look for working women with adult children, living with adult children. Now, when you look at this stuff and you look at as I said, every large city and even medium-sized cities, and particularly here in St. Louis, there are city directories. And the ones in St. Louis go back to 1840s. Even in 1840s, you may find African Americans being listed, especially if they were not enslaved. And by the way, do not assume that every one of your ancestors was enslaved. Do not assume that. If you find an ancestry in the census, that suggests very strongly that they were not enslaved at that time. So you want to follow the city directories forward until you get to the 1870s. Again, as I said, 1840s, and you move forward to 1870s, year by year. And of course, it's going to take some time, but you have your cup of tea and you're sitting there at your dining room table. You're comfortable. You don't have to do it all at the same time. You see that ancestor as they move about the neighborhood, change jobs, because all this information is indicated in the city directories as their children develop and get older and move out. And when that person, perhaps John Jones or something, is no longer there, you have to assume that he passed on, especially if his wife is no longer there. But if his wife, Mary Jones, is still there, you're likely to find her listed as widow at the same address with the same children. The benefit of the city directories is that the census only comes out every 10 years, and even state census only come out every 5 years when they do. The city directory comes out every year, so you can trace that ancestor during the migration period, during the Reconstruction period, all the way up to February 25th, 2021. Next slide, please. Okay, this section we're winding down now. This section I call bits and pieces in the African American genealogy toolbox. We can go and we can use Family Search or Ancestry.com or go to the National Archives or genealogy box, whatever they call it, bank, I'm sorry, genealogy bank, or a myriad of other websites, free and subscription. But there's still some things that you won't find online. And I encourage you, I urge you to use your creative thoughts, your creative process to see what else you could find that will help take you through some things. So let us begin here. I don't want you to have to try to remember this. I just want to key you in so when everything else is fine, is not working for you, this may crop up and may get you to get up and be creative. Next slide, please. Okay, there is something in the law and legal concept called pari facie. This is a Latin term which in which the court tells the sheriff based on the judgment to sell the defendant's property. Now, this is still used today, but it certainly is useful when it gets back to the slave period. This judgment authorizes the judge, so you can see here in the red triangle where it's shortened from Faria Facia to FIFA, F-I-F-A. It's kind of covering it up. In this particular article, and it usually shows up because whenever a legal judgment is done in the old days, it showed up in the newspaper to let people in the community know that something has happened and they can take the necessary action if they want to be involved. In many cases, it meant that enslaved people who were considered part of the property were going to be sold. So they wanted to let that be known. So the sheriff would see that this information got into a newspaper where he says, by virtue of the above writs of Faria Facius, issued from the office of the clerk of the Circuit Court of Noxubee County, Mississippi, to my directed, I will offer for sale for cash to the highest bidder at the courthouse door in the town of Macon on Monday, the 17th of August, 1840, the following named Negroes, viz. Carrie, Washington, Jane and her child Benton, Eliza and her child Angelina, Matilda and her two children, Lucinda and Alfred, levied on the properties of E.A. Messingale to satisfy the above writ of Faria Facia. And then below that, it has his name, James Poindexter, Sheriff, July 14, 1840. So what do we have here? We have the name of the slave owner. And if someone bought these enslaved people, there had to be a bill of sale, which would be where? At the courthouse in Noxubee County, Mississippi. And the date that we would be looking for is Monday, the 17th of August, 1840, because that's the date of the event. And we know what enslaved people we're looking for because their names are already there. So all you have to do, again, is sit at your dining room table and go to America, Chronicling America, which is a National Archives website, and put in Noxubee County or FIFA or E.A. Messingale or Floyd and Moores, and see if you find this article. Or you can do a search in Chronicling America and simply put in quotations, F-I-F-A, that is open quotations, F-I-F-A, close quotations, and see if any of these FIFAs show up, and then you check. Now, if you're looking at Chronicling America, you will know that you can go by county, you can look by city, you can look by date. Again, Chronicling America explains themselves, so I won't need to go into that right now, but I'll answer any questions that you may have later. Next slide, please. Remember when I was talking about marriage license? Yeah, this is a marriage license of my great-grandfather. And I found out, I didn't even know this. I found out later that this was his second marriage. After all of these years, it never came up that he had been married twice. You see a number in the upper right-hand corner, which is the page number. And then the reason I point that out is there's an index at the beginning of this. And that index will give the name of my grandfather, great-grandfather, who was Benjamin F. Davis, who married an Opal Blakewell. When you go to that marriage license, marriage book, it's going to tell you that. So you have to find the page that gives this license information. Now you will hear, and I'm sure that some of you have heard, that that African Americans are found in the back of the books. That's true in a lot of cases, especially in the deep southern states like Alabama and Mississippi, but that's not always the case. So don't just go directly to the back of the book. You have to go through the index. Many of them are indexed, and it may take you a while to get to the. I urge you to have a bit of patience, and you can find this information. I see that he was in Joplin, Missouri, and I didn't know that he had moved from Madison County, Missouri, to Joplin, Missouri, in Jasper County. Next slide, please. Again, remember, we're doing bits and pieces here. This young woman, I have no idea who she is. She's not related, of course. Her name was Nellie Ruth Martin, and it says supply, so I'm assuming that she worked in supply in a war plant during World War II. Well, during World War II, when civilians worked for the government in some capacity, they generated a massive civilian workforce folder. And these folders are kept in the National Archives, of which you can access. However, the government has gotten slick, and now they charge you, I believe it's like $25, maybe a bit more than that, to get a copy of it. You have to show that the person is deceased, or that you are a descendant of that person, you know, like a grandchild or something like that. But you can get a copy of the file, and they have quite a bit of information in it. As you can see on the right, is a list of Mary Oatney. It gives all of her addresses from 1934 to 1941. That's some great information. It gives also a social security number, which doesn't seem right to me, but 060, which doesn't seem right to me, but that's what's typed in there. But it gives her the city and state that she lived in, as well as all of these others. So that's great information. And Lord only knows how much more information you would find if you saw her entire file. Now she's clearly deceased, and you can usually find that out before you even go that far, so you're not frustrated. Look at the state that the person lived in and see if they have a death certificate online. Many states are putting their death certificates online now. Missouri is great in that you can find death certificates online from, I believe it's 1910 to 1962. And the reason for that is the privacy rights, because it has to be 72 years so that you're not invading a living person's privacy. But you're not looking for current death certificates, you're looking for older death certificates. If they're World War I, clearly the person's going to be dead. If you're looking for World War II, it's a good chance that there will be, since we're coming up on what, 70, 75 years, 70 years. So just look for that and keep checking. Remember, genealogy and family history is not a one-off thing. It's an ongoing thing. You don't have to do it every day, every minute of every day. You do it for a while and you stop and you go and play tennis or whatever you're going to do. And 6 months later, you come back on and do a little bit more on it. And each time you find a little more about something. And even family members who are not interested may at times send something to you. You know, I was looking at such and such a thing, and I know you like this stuff, so I'm sending this to you, and not realizing that it opens up a huge door or helps you to break down a massive brick wall you've been dealing with for years. So keep an open mind. I will tell you this, you can combine genealogy, African American history and genealogy with your lifestyle. I've traveled I've traveled to many different places with this in mind and enjoyed the place that I've gone to and spent some time uh, doing a bit of research. That means the Caribbean, that means Haiti, that means Cuba, that means Spain. So African people, even your African people, you may find all over this earth. There is a place called St. Helena or St. Helena. It's an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a small island in the middle of Atlantic. It is where Napoleon Bonaparte died and was buried. There were African enslaved people there. Go on the internet and look up St. Helena Island. You will be enthralled to see this sort of thing. African people showed up all over this earth. Next slide, please. I'll go through this quickly. In Missouri, this is a screenshot. In Missouri, you can go to our Secretary of State's website and you can click on quick links or browse collection. You can't do it here. You just have to go online to do it. And you can find penitentiary records. Now, many of us might be ashamed to discover that we had some ancestors who we might not be very proud of, but we can't undo the past. Many times, as today, African Americans were penalized or put into prison for little or no reason. And so those records are there. Those records are now online, and in many states, you can find prison records are not private. Just to make sure, I didn't find any, of course, what am I saying? I didn't find any of my ancestors yet who had prison records. But what I did find, those of you who are a bit older might recognize the old song called Frankie and not Frankie and Johnny, Stagger Lee, the song of Stagger Lee. Stagger Lee's real name was Lee Sheldon. And so I found his records in Missouri, which opens up a whole new interest because it gives details of him, of his father, of his mother, and an exquisite description of the man, down to how many scars he had on his head, the fact that he was cross-eyed in his left eye. That's information that you're not likely to find anywhere else. So if you have an ancestor who may have been imprisoned, you may find out more information than you ever thought you would ever find, and know something more about this person. Not to mention, of course, that you find out what he was in prison or she was in prison for. As you can see here, if you look down there, you can see Lee Shelton, the offender, and his alias was Stack Lee. He was a male, he was colored, and his date of birth and where he was born, his nativity, he was born in Texas. What he did for a living, he was a laborer. And what he was in for was murder. He killed Billy Lyons. And in the song, it says, Billy Lyons is pleading for his life. And he says, I have a sickly wife and two little children. And in the process, I was able to find his children and then do a bit of historical research for my own curiosity, just to make sure that this information is correct. So don't overlook the penitentiary and even insane asylums or tuberculosis hospitals, any institution like that that will have a record of your ancestors. Next slide, please. In Missouri, and I don't know if many other states do this, they probably do, so it'd be worth to check it out. In Missouri, in the Secretary of State's website, the men who had been in the military were obliged to fill out a form when they got back to their hometowns, and that form would be sent to the Secretary of State's office for the record keepers for whatever reason. I did it myself. I don't think young men do it anymore, or young women now. But in it, there's some useful information because my grandfather's full name, for whom I am named, James A. Davis, and it gives his Army serial number and his race, his hometown, and the box number, post office box number. It gives when he was drafted and his age when he was drafted was 24 and a third years old. The company that he was sent to, the military company, headquarters company, infantry, regiment camp, Funston, to 4 December 17. If you do a bit of research on Camp Funston, you'll know that they had quite a bit of racial problems during that period. And I used to wonder why, whenever I would talk to my grandfather about it, about his military, he would get a bit upset about that part of his life. When he got out, he made corporal, and he got out in 1918. He had served overseas. He was honorably discharged, and he received no injuries, no wounds. So that's a bit of information that you might want to use. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Now, let's have a little bit of fun. As I said earlier, many of us have photographs, pictures hidden all over the house in scrapbooks and every place else. And we look at those pictures who were left by ancestors or anybody else in our family, and we look at them and we go, I don't know who these people are. Or you look at them with your young one in your family and they're asking, well, who is this and who is that? And you're stumped. Here's how to have some fun. Remember what we said? People who take these photographs are looking at you and they're saying, remember me, I was here. Well, what we can do to find out who these people were is to analyze the photograph. It doesn't take a genius. You don't have to be a Sherlock Holmes, or you can be if you want to, if you think of yourself as one. It's elementary. Analyze the pictures. Don't just focus on the central figures in the picture. Look at the entire picture, sort of break it down in your mind, section by section, and things will start to reveal themselves. I started to leave these arrows out and sort of not, but let me show you how it's done. First, let's look at the very top. We look at the trees where it's fall, but it's a warm day because none of the figures are wearing coats. There are no leaves on the trees. There is a mailbox in the background on a pedestal, and it's painted the old-fashioned olive drab. Nowadays, the mailboxes are blue. And the old post mailboxes like that were popular between 1930s and the 1950s. The jacket that the young man is wearing is a peaked lapel, and they were popular between the 40s and 50s. Behind him is a wooden step on a telephone pole. Now, the reason I point this out is you can date a part of this photograph from that telephone pole. You see the little white looking or light colored chip that seems to be on that pole? It was called a step by the maintenance people, a step, where the maintenance people would climb up that and as the first step and then climb up the pole to do maintenance. By the 1960s, these little steps were removed, the wooden steps were removed and replaced with metal steps that the maintenance guy would come in and hook on, and then he could climb up the pole. And when he finished his work, he climbed down and he could remove the step. Now, the reason for that is that kids would climb up there and get themselves in trouble. And I assume that the phone company and so forth got sued enough that they wanted to modify that. On the right, we noticed that telephone box with the wire going up to the top. Now, this was typical in the 1950s when telephones were being connected, and sometimes where there were party lines. I know many of the young people don't know what the heck a party line is. But we're narrowing the date of this photograph. There's an arrow pointing to the young lady's head, and it's pointing to her hair. And the reason it is because this also dates the picture to around the 1950s, because women were not using perm, Black women were not using perm as much. It was just beginning, and most Black women were not using it. They simply had what they call pressed hair, right? So down below, there is an arrow pointing to the headlights on the car. And first, let me tell you, this was a Jeep. And this was the first year that this particular Jeep, which was all metal, was sold. Because before that, the doors and the part of the back panels were made of wood. In fact, they nicknamed them Woodies. This particular headlight was changed in the 1950s. I think you can see where I'm going. We'll come back to the car in just a minute, because that's our key. Below is a concrete slab. There's no basement here. This house has no basement. It's built on a concrete slab. That means that I can conclude that this was done in the South, but not in the deep South, because if it was in Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana, it probably would not have a clear fall period where the leaves fall off the trees. However, it is warm and no basement. So I can say that this is more likely South Carolina or the northern part of Florida. Might be even Virginia. Those are the three that I would look for, is where this picture was taken. The little girl looks to be about 2 years old. The woman is wearing stockings, as we called it in the old days, which had a reinforced heel and a seam in the back. I don't know what that says. I think we're talking 50s as well. So when was this picture made? Well, if you look at, well, let me explain everything else, because there's an arrow leading from his socks. Argyle socks were quite popular in the 50s, that you were really dressed to be hip with Argyle socks. But getting back to the car, if you look at the young woman's waistline, you see a silver looking strip there. What do they call it? Grill. And you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 silver or aluminum grills. If you go to the internet and you look up Jeep for the year 1950 to 1955, you will see the only year that the Jeep manufacturers created this kind of Jeep with this type of headlight and those 4 grills was 1955. So we've just shown when this picture was made. So this young couple is clearly showing off their car and their baby. Now we can make some assumptions that these are not poor factory working people, that they're probably, for that period of time, they're probably school teachers. That's the conclusion I would draw, because they are, I would say that they were middle-class African Americans. We can determine the date, I'm sorry, not the date, but the time of day. Now, please pay attention to this. We can determine the time of day by looking at the young man and his shadow, which makes a sundial, the arrow that's pointing to the sun shining from his head down to the top of his head on the shadow, and the arrow is just skewed because I had it right there. But we can tell that this is what? Just around between 1 and 1:30 in the afternoon. We can say that it is probably a weekend. It's probably not a Sunday because they're not dressed for Sunday. The young man's not wearing a tie, and I think the woman is dressed. I don't know a lot about women's dress, but I don't think she's dressed for church. They're facing west. I'm sorry, not west, but east, because the sun is going down and they're squinting because they're all looking into the sun. And you can see the young child there is squinting even more. So we've narrowed this photograph down to late afternoon, 1955, middle class, probably school teachers, north, south, or Virginia. And at least they have a party line, telephone. Think about this when you pick up the next picture. And you don't need all of this stuff, and they could be in a photograph in a studio. And if you are diligent, you can figure out a lot about a photograph. Last slide, please. Every time I show this picture, all the ladies go, oh, isn't he cute? Well, I want you to think about this. I want you to take 30 seconds, look at this photograph, and you don't have to do anything, but I want you to see if in 30 seconds what you can figure out. And I'm just going to point out a couple of things after about 30 seconds. Okay, I'm not giving you 30 seconds. I'm going to tell you now so we can move on. This is our last slide. This young man, we can date this photograph even though he's in his home. We don't need to look at the trees and the ground and all that. We can tell that this is Easter Sunday and that he lives in a middle-class home, and it's probably in the South, and I'll tell you why. First of all, he's wearing his new Easter suit that is ill-fitted, ill-tailored, but he's standing on a wall-to-wall carpeting. Wall-to-wall carpeting became prevalent in African American homes around the 1950s, and it started in Georgia. The drum table behind him is another feature that gives you around the 1940s. Maybe some of you ladies can help me on that. On the top of the record player is a Roy Rogers clock horse that was very popular in the 50s. Behind the young man is a rabbit on the table, which tells us it's the Easter season. It may be Easter Sunday, and I would say that because he's dressed to the nines, that it's probably Easter Sunday. He's standing there with his hand on a Stromberg Carlson combination AM, FM radio and record player, which became popular in the late 50s and early 60s. It's difficult to see it now, but for some reason, ever since I first saw this picture, I have no idea who he is. The picture on top of the record player, somehow I concluded that that's not his father, but his uncle. I don't know why. But the picture below that you cannot see because of the reproduction shows a young man who was in the military. And we can determine what unit he was from based on the piping on his cap. You can't see it now, but you can conclude that. Now, how do I know that's a Stromberg Carlson? You see the black strip just above the dials? I counted the dots on that Stromberg on that record player, and it comes out to the exact numbers of the letters that spell out Stromberg Carlson. Maybe that's how nerdy I am, but you can do those kinds of things and come to some conclusion. Now, what does all of this mean? Well, it means if you have an ancestor who had a son who would have been about 2-3 years old in the late 1950s or so, and living in Georgia or even Alabama, you would be able to figure out who this young man is from the census. So if your Aunt Susie and Uncle George had a baby whose name was John, and in 1961, say, he was 3 years old or 4 years old or even 5 years old, with a little more information, you can conclude that this is their child, and you have a whole bunch of information to work on. Okay, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for sticking with me and enduring this lecture.
Thank
And
you so much, Jim. We really
sure.
appreciate you sharing this time with us. I have to say, like, I've learned a lot through this presentation. I have all my links stored. I hope everyone had a chance to take their notes, store your links. And we just want to thank you for sharing your time and experience this evening. To all of our virtual visitors, if you're interested in supporting MHS through membership, we would be so grateful to have your support. And right now, I'm putting a link to our membership in the chat. Also, your feedback is always important to us. We would really appreciate if you could take our short survey. A Kobo Toolbox survey should have opened in one of your browser tabs. So keep an eye out for that when we end this session. If you enjoyed this evening's program, please visit mohistory.org for more information on our upcoming STL History Live series. And join us next time, April 22nd at 6:30 p.m. We'll be having a conversation with EHOC about fair housing and environmental justice, specifically looking at some of the water issues that we've been having in the St. Louis region. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. And thank you, Jim, for giving us your time.
You're very welcome.